My dad's new wife tried charging me $1,200 rent to stay in my own house. She didn't realize I was the actual owner, and her eviction notice was already signed. Now she want me to forget this ever happened. I, 32M, never thought I'd be standing in my childhood home, being handed an invoice for rent by a woman I'd met exactly 3 times before, staring at a printed spreadsheet with my name at the top and $1,200 in bold letters at the bottom. Let me back up. My mom passed away when I was 19. Cancer took her in 8 months, and those 8 months changed everything about who my dad was. He became a shell of himself, going through motions, barely speaking. I was dealing with my own grief while watching him crumble. And honestly, those years after her death were the hardest of my life. We got through it together though. Slowly, painfully, but we did. When I turned 23, Dad sat me down and told me he was signing the house over to me. The house had been in Mom's family for generations, passed down from her grandmother, and Mom had always made it clear she wanted me to have it. Dad said he couldn't bear the idea of selling it or letting it go to anyone else. He wanted to honor her wishes. I tried to refuse because it felt wrong. Like I was taking something from him, but he insisted. He said Mom would have wanted it this way, and he'd feel better knowing it was legally mine. So we went to a lawyer, had everything drawn up properly, and the house became mine. Dad could live there as long as he wanted. Obviously, that was never even a question. Fast forward 9 years, I'd moved out at 25 for work, relocated about 4 hours away for a job opportunity I couldn't pass up. He'd started going out more, joined a book club, even started volunteering at the community center. I called him every week, visited every couple of months. Things felt stable. Then, about 8 months ago, he mentioned he'd started seeing someone. Her name was irrelevant to me then, and it's irrelevant now, so I'll just call her what she became, the problem. He seemed happy when he talked about her, mentioned she was a widow, that they'd met at some charity event. I was glad he'd found companionship. He deserved that, after everything. 4 months ago, he called to tell me they'd gotten married. It was a small ceremony at the courthouse, just them and 2 witnesses. I was hurt he hadn't invited me, but he explained that they'd wanted something simple and quick. No fuss. I swallowed my disappointment and congratulated him. He sounded genuinely happy, and that was enough for me. I met her for the first time at a family dinner Dad organized a month after the wedding. She was pleasant enough, smiled a lot, asked me surface-level questions about my job and life. Nothing raised any red flags. She seems normal. Maybe a little too interested in the house, asking about the property value and the neighborhood. But I figured she was just making conversation. The second time I met her was at Dad's birthday 2 months ago. Again, nothing concerning. She played hostess, seemed to enjoy fussing over Dad, made a decent meal. I went home thinking Dad had found someone good. The third time I saw her was last week. I'd taken a few days off work to visit Dad and handle some personal business in my hometown. I texted Dad that I was coming, and he said that was great, that he'd be happy to see me. When I arrived at the house on a Thursday afternoon, Dad wasn't there. She was. She opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and told me Dad was out running errands, but would be back soon. And immediately something felt off. The furniture had been rearranged. Some of Mom's pictures were gone from the walls. There were new decorative touches everywhere that screamed her taste. Not Mom's, not even Dad's. I tried to shake off the weird feeling and asked if I could put my stuff in my old room. That's when her expression changed. She told me that room was being used as her home office now, and that I'd need to sleep in the guest room. I felt a flash of irritation but didn't push it. Fine, whatever. It was just a room. I went to the guest room, dropped my bag, and came back downstairs. She was in the kitchen, and she gestured for me to sit at the table. She had that same smile on, the one that was starting to feel more like a mask than genuine warmth. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table to me. I looked down at it, genuinely confused at first. It was an invoice. My name was typed at the top. Below that were itemized charges, room occupancy, utilities, shared living space usage. At the bottom, in bold, total due, $1,200. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I looked up at her and asked what this was supposed to be. She folded her hands on the table and explained, in the most condescending tone imaginable, that now that she and Dad were married, they'd discussed the household finances and agreed that anyone staying in the house needed to contribute. She said it was only fair that I was an adult with a job, and that $1,200 a month was actually quite reasonable for the area. I felt my brain short-circuit. I asked her if Dad knew about this. She assured me he did, that they talked about it extensively, and that he agreed it was the right move. She added that I'd been freeloading long enough, and it was time I took responsibility. Freeloading. In the house I owned. I didn't correct her right then. I was too stunned, and part of me wanted to see how far she'd take this. I told her I'd need to think about it, and talk to Dad first. She seemed satisfied with that, like she'd won some small victory, and told me she expected payment by the end of the month if I planned to stay. When Dad came home an hour later, I pulled him aside immediately, and asked him about the rent situation. His face went pale. He had no idea what I was talking about. He said he'd never discussed charging me rent, that he'd never even considered it. I showed him the invoice, and I watched the color drain completely from his face. He looked horrified, angry, confused all at once. He confronted her right there in the living room. She didn't back down. She told him they'd talked about it, that he must have forgotten, that she was just trying to help manage the household better. Dad insisted he'd never agree to anything like that. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising, and I stepped in to say I was going to a hotel for the night to let them sort it out. Dad begged me not to leave, but I couldn't stay there, not with that tension, not with her looking at me like I was some kind of intruder. I grabbed my bag and left. At the hotel, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a good hour, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Then I got angry. Really angry. This woman had been in my father's life for less than a year, married to him for 4 months, and she was already trying to claim authority over a house that wasn't hers. Worse, she was trying to extort money from me for staying in my own property. He was the same one who'd handled the property transfer years ago, and he remembered the case clearly. I explained the situation, and he told me I had every legal right to remove her from the property if I wanted to. The house was solely in my name. Dad had legal occupancy as per our informal agreement, but his wife had no claim whatsoever. I asked what my options were. He laid them out plainly. I could issue a formal eviction notice, give her the standard 30 days to vacate, and enforce it through the courts if necessary. Or I could try to handle it informally, talk to Dad, see if they'd be willing to move out together, and avoid legal mess. I thought about it for all of 5 seconds. She'd tried to scam me. She'd disrespected my mother's memory by erasing her presence from the house. She'd manipulated my father and tried to gaslight both of us. Informal was off the table. I told my lawyer to draft the eviction notice. He had it ready by that afternoon. I drove back to the house, and this time I didn't knock. I used my key and walked straight in. She was in the living room, watching television like nothing had happened. Dad was at home again. I asked where Dad was. She said he'd gone to clear his head, that he'd been upset all night, and that I really should apologize for causing so much drama. The audacity of this woman was breathtaking. I placed the eviction notice on the coffee table in front of her, and told her she had 30 days to vacate the property. She looked at the paper, then at me, and laughed. Actually laughed. She said I couldn't evict her from her own home, that I was being ridiculous, and that she was calling Dad to deal with me. I told her to read the document. She picked it up, still smiling, and I watched that smile fade as her eyes scanned the pages. She read it once, then again, and then looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget. Shock, rage, disbelief, all mixed together. She asked how this was possible. I explained calmly that the house had been transferred to me 9 years ago, that it was legally mine, and that she had no ownership stake or legal right to be there beyond my tolerance. I added that my tolerance had run out the moment she tried to charge me rent. She started yelling. Called me ungrateful, spoiled, vindictive. Said I was trying to ruin my father's happiness. That I was a terrible son. I let her vent. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I told her the eviction stood. That she could contest it in court if she wanted. But my lawyer was confident it would hold. Then I walked out. I called Dad from the car and told him everything. He needed to know what I'd done and why. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said he understood. That he was sorry. That he'd had no idea she was like this. He sounded broken, and I hated that, but I also knew I'd made the right call. Dad called me back a few hours later. He'd gone home and confronted her about the eviction notice. She'd apparently broken down, cried, begged, promised it was all a misunderstanding. She told him she'd only been trying to help with finances, that she didn't realize I owned the house, that if she'd known, she never would have said anything. Dad didn't buy it. He told me he'd asked her point blank if she'd really thought she could charge his son rent, and she'd admitted she assumed the house was his, that they owned it together as a married couple. The mental gymnastics required for that assumption were Olympic level. We'd all signed documents. Dad had told her early on that the house was mine. But she'd either ignored that information or convinced herself it wasn't true. Dad said he was going to stay with a friend for a few days to think things through. He sounded exhausted. I told him I was sorry it had come to this. And he said it wasn't my fault. Over the next week she tried everything. She called me 6 times. I didn't answer. She left voicemails alternating between apologetic and hostile. One message she'd be crying, saying she made a mistake, and just wanted to fix things. The next she'd be threatening legal action, saying I regret this. I saved every single one and forwarded them to my lawyer. She showed up at my apartment 4 hours away. I have no idea how she got my address, but she did. I didn't let her in. She stood in the hallway of my building and shouted through the door that I was tearing the family apart. That Dad would never forgive me. That I was being cruel and heartless. A neighbor threatened to call the police, and she finally left. The worst part was what she tried to do to Dad. She told him I threatened her, that I'd been verbally abusive, that I was trying to isolate him from her. Dad, to his credit, didn't believe her. He'd seen enough by that point. But the fact that she tried to manipulate him like that made my blood boil. 2 weeks into the 30-day eviction period, my lawyer received a call from her lawyer. Apparently she'd lawyered up and wanted to negotiate. Her position was that as Dad's spouse, she had a legal right to reside in the marital home. My lawyer shut that down immediately. Explained that the property wasn't the marital home in any legal sense since Dad didn't own it, and that spousal rights didn't extend to property owned by third parties, even if that third party was Dad's son. Her lawyer tried a few more angles, all of which went nowhere. Eventually, they dropped it. 3 weeks in, Dad filed for divorce. He told me he couldn't stay married to someone who'd lie to him, manipulate him, and try to scam his son. He said he'd been lonely after Mom died, desperate for companionship, and he'd ignored red flags because he wanted to believe he'd found someone good. He apologized for bringing her into our lives, and I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He'd been trying to move forward. He couldn't have known. We're at day 28 now. She hasn't left yet, but she will. My lawyer's already prepared the next steps if she tries to overstay. Dad's staying with me temporarily while the divorce processes. He seems lighter somehow, like a weight's been lifted. Yesterday she sent me a text. It was long, rambling, and boiled down to one request. Forget this ever happened. She said if I dropped the eviction, she'd leave quietly, no drama, no court, and we could all move on. She said she'd made mistakes, but didn't deserve to be homeless. She promised she'd never contact me again. I didn't respond. She doesn't get to try to extort me, harass me, manipulate my father, and then ask for mercy. She doesn't get to erase what she did, just because it's convenient for her now. The eviction stands. In 2 days, if she's not out, the sheriff will remove her. Dad asked me this morning if I felt good about how this all turned out. Honestly, I don't feel good. I feel tired. I feel angry that it came to this. But I also feel certain I did the right thing. She showed me exactly who she was, and I responded accordingly. Some people think protecting what's yours makes you cold. Maybe they're right. But I'd rather be cold than be a doormat. That house is my inheritance from my mother. The last piece of her I have that's tangible and real. No one gets to take that from me. No one gets to disrespect her memory or exploit my father. So no, I won't forget this happened. And in 2 days, she'll be gone. Update 1. It's been a week since the eviction deadline, and I need to get this all out because the last 7 days have been absolutely insane. She didn't leave on day 30. I wasn't surprised. My lawyer had warned me there was a good chance she'd try to drag it out, force us to go through the sheriff's department, make it as difficult as possible. He was right. On day 30, I drove to the house with Dad and my lawyer. We knocked. No answer. We could see movement inside through the windows, shadows passing by. So, we knew she was there. My lawyer documented everything, took photos, noted the time. He filed the necessary paperwork with the court that afternoon, and the sheriff's department scheduled the physical eviction for 3 days later. Those 3 days were a nightmare of waiting. She ramped up her harassment campaign. The calls and texts to my phone had stopped after I blocked her number, but she found other ways. She created fake social media accounts and sent me messages there. She contacted my workplace, tried to get through to me that way. My assistant fielded 2 calls from someone claiming to be a family member with an emergency before we figured out it was her. She even tried to turn other family members against me. She called my aunt, Mom's sister, and spun some story about how I was kicking her and Dad out onto the street, how I was being vindictive and cruel. My aunt called me, concerned, and I had to explain the entire situation. Once she heard the truth, she was furious on my behalf. She actually called the woman back and tore into her. I would have paid money to hear that conversation. The day of the sheriff's supervised eviction arrived. I took the day off work and met Dad and my lawyer at the house at 9 in the morning. The sheriff's deputies were already there, 2 of them, looking bored and professional. They'd clearly done this 100 times before. One of the deputies knocked on the door and announced their presence. We heard scrambling inside, raised voices, something crashing. Then the door opened. She looked terrible. Her hair was a mess, her clothes wrinkled, eyes red and swollen. For a split second, I almost felt bad. Almost. Then, she opened her mouth. She started screaming at the deputies that this was her home, that I was illegally evicting her, that her husband owned the property. The deputies asked for documentation. She couldn't provide any, of course, because it didn't exist. My lawyer handed over our paperwork. The property deed in my name, the eviction notice, the court order authorizing the removal. The deputies reviewed everything and told her she needed to vacate immediately. She refused. She literally sat down on the floor in the entryway and said she wasn't leaving. The deputies exchanged a look, and one of them calmly explained that she could leave voluntarily or be removed by force, and if she chose the latter, she'd be facing additional charges. Dad tried to intervene. He stepped forward and told her this didn't need to be so difficult, that she should just go, that making it worse wouldn't help anything. She looked at him with such venom in her eyes and told him he was weak, that he'd chosen his brat son over his wife, that he'd regret this. He stepped back and didn't say anything else. She finally stood up, and for a moment I thought she was going to leave peacefully. Instead, she bolted for the stairs. One of the deputies went after her, while the other stayed with us. We heard her upstairs slamming doors, yelling something incoherent. When the deputy finally got her back downstairs, she was carrying a trash bag stuffed with what I assumed were her belongings. The deputies escorted her out to the front yard. She stood there on the lawn, clutching her trash bag, and stared at the house like she could will herself back inside. Then she turned to me. She told me I'd pay for this, that karma would catch up to me, that I was a miserable person who'd end up alone just like I deserved. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The deputies suggested she move along, and after another minute of glaring, she finally walked away down the street. Once she was gone, the deputies did a sweep of the house to make sure it was clear. Dad and I waited outside. When they gave us the all clear, we went in. The place was trashed. Not destroyed, but definitely vandalized. She'd emptied the kitchen cabinets onto the floor, left the refrigerator door open, poured something sticky on the counters. Upstairs, she'd torn down curtains, knocked over furniture, emptied drawers. In my old room, her so-called home office, she'd shredded papers and left them scattered everywhere like confetti. The worst part was the living room. She'd taken Mom's remaining pictures, the ones she hadn't already removed, and smashed the frames. The glass was everywhere, and the photos themselves were torn. I stood there staring at a picture of Mom holding me as a baby, ripped right down the middle, and something in me broke. Dad saw it too. He picked up the pieces carefully, like he could somehow put them back together, and I watched tears run down his face. He apologized again, kept saying he was sorry. And I had to tell him to stop because none of this was his fault. We spent the rest of the day cleaning. My aunt came over to help once she heard what happened. The 3 of us worked for hours, throwing away broken things, salvaging what we could, trying to restore some sense of order. By evening, the house was livable again, but it felt violated somehow, tainted. I filed a police report for the property damage. The officer who took the report was sympathetic, but told me cases like this rarely resulted in charges unless the damage was extensive. It wasn't. It was just mean-spirited. Over the next few days, things finally started to settle. Dad moved back into the house. He seemed more like himself, more present. We had long conversations about everything that had happened, about Mom, about his loneliness, about how he'd let himself be blinded by the idea of companionship. He told me he was going to take some time to be on his own, to figure out who he was outside of being someone's husband. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. Then, 2 days ago, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was her lawyer. He told me his client was willing to drop any potential claims or future legal action if I agreed to a settlement. I asked what kind of settlement. He said she wanted $50,000 for emotional distress and wrongful eviction. I actually laughed out loud. I told him there was no wrongful eviction, that every step had been legal and documented, and that his client had no grounds for any claim. He gave me some rehearsed speech about how these things could get messy in court, how it might be easier to just settle and move on. I told him to tell his client to try me. Then I hung up and called my lawyer. My lawyer was even less amused than I was. He contacted her lawyer and made it crystal clear that if they filed any frivolous lawsuit, we'd countersue for the property damage, harassment, and legal fees. He also mentioned we had documented evidence of her creating fake accounts to contact me and showing up at my residence uninvited, which could constitute stalking depending on how aggressive we wanted to be. Her lawyer backed off immediately. We haven't heard anything since. Dad's divorce is moving forward. She's apparently contesting it, trying to drag it out, asking for spousal support. Dad's lawyer isn't worried. They were married for 4 months. There's no significant shared assets. It'll be finalized soon enough. Yesterday, Dad and I sat on the back porch of the house, the same porch where Mom used to drink her coffee every morning. He asked me if I regretted how I handled everything. I told him no. He nodded and said he didn't either, that he was grateful I'd stood up for myself and for Mom's memory. We sat there in silence for a while. And then he told me something I didn't know. He said that a few weeks into his marriage, she'd started asking about the house's value, about whether he ever considered selling, moving somewhere new. He said he'd shut that down immediately, told her the house wasn't for sale and never would be. He said she'd seemed upset but dropped it. He could see she'd been planning something, even then. Maybe not the rent scheme specifically, but something. She'd wanted access to the house's value, one way or another. Hearing that made everything click into place. She hadn't just been opportunistic when she handed me that invoice. She'd been working an angle from the start. The whole marriage might have been about getting her hands on property she thought Dad owned. It made me sick. It also made me certain I'd done the right thing. I don't know what she's doing now or where she ended up. I don't care. She's out of our lives and that's all that matters. Dad's talking about repainting the living room, putting Mom's pictures back up properly, maybe even getting some of the old furniture out of storage. He wants to make the house feel like home again, the way it did before she came into the picture. I told him I'd help however he needed. The house is still mine legally, but it's his home. It always has been. And now finally it can be that again, without someone trying to twist it into something else. Some people might think I was too harsh, that I should have given her a chance to explain or work things out. But the truth is, she showed me exactly who she was with that invoice. Everything that came after just confirmed it. I protected what was mine, what was Mom's, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat.